New York City never sleeps, but that doesn't mean it's always alive. Some corners of it feel abandoned even when packed with people. That was my first thought when I moved into my new apartment, a fourth-floor walk-up in an old brownstone on the Lower East Side. The rent was cheap. Too cheap. I knew why. 6 months ago, a man was murdered in this unit. No forced entry, no witnesses. Just a police report, a bloodstain that had long since been scrubbed away, and a dead tenant whose case went cold. I didn't care. I wasn't superstitious. I had lived in worse places, heard worse stories. New York is full of history and most of it isn't pretty. The apartment itself was small, with exposed brick walls and warped wooden floors. The air smelled stale, like no one had lived here in a while. The landlord had repainted, but there were odd little details they hadn't bothered to fix, like the deep scratches on the inside of the bathroom door. The first night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The city hummed outside, distant sirens, car horns, the occasional shout. But inside the apartment it was too quiet. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something. A creak. Not the old building kind of creak. Not pipes or floorboards settling. It came from the living room. A slow, deliberate sound, like weight shifting on wood. I held my breath. Listen. Nothing. I told myself it was just the building. Or maybe my upstairs neighbor. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found my kitchen cabinet door open. I was sure I had closed it the night before. Shrugging it off, I made coffee, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I reached for a mug, something made me pause. On the counter, just next to the sink, someone had traced a shape in the thin layer of dust. A single, perfect handprint. For the next few days, I told myself that everything had a reasonable explanation. Old buildings creak. Cabinets don't always latch properly. Dust shifts in the air. I kept repeating these things because the alternative, actually believing something was wrong, was worse. I settled into a routine. Mornings were predictable. A cup of coffee, a half-hearted attempt at breakfast, then out the door before I had time to dwell on anything. Work was dull but grounding, the familiar monotony of a desk, emails, and idle office chatter keeping my mind occupied. But coming home, stepping into that dim, quiet apartment was something else. The space felt different at night. The walls seemed to press closer, the shadows stretched longer, the silence thicker than it should have been. Then came the noises. At first they were subtle. A faint creak from the living room while I was in bed. A barely perceptible shuffle in the hallway. Nothing distinct, nothing undeniable. But one night, I woke up to something I couldn't ignore. A soft tap, tap, tap. I lay still, holding my breath. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't the radiator or the pipes. It was inside. Slow. Rhythmic. Not knocking, more like fingers drumming lightly against the surface. I turned my head toward the bedroom door, my heartbeat slowing to a deep, painful thud in my chest. The noise was coming from the living room. I didn't move for what felt like hours. The sound would stop, then start again. A slow, deliberate tap, 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 like someone testing if I was awake. Finally, I forced myself up. My apartment was small, barely a dozen steps from my bed to the living room. The air was thick, stale. I felt the weight of it in my lungs as I stepped out, as if I were walking into something unseen. The apartment was dark, except for the faint, amber glow of the street lamp leaking through the blinds. My eyes adjusted slowly. I scanned the room, heart hammering, fingers curling into fists. Nothing. The coffee table, the chair, the half-empty bottle of whiskey from the night before, everything was exactly where it should be. Then my eyes fell on the window. The blinds were drawn shut, but they swayed ever so slightly, as if something had brushed against them. I stared at them, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then came the worst part. From the corner of the room, near the door where the shadows were deepest, there was a sound. A single, slow inhale. Not my breath. Someone else's. The breath was faint but unmistakable. It had weight, the quiet pull of air through unseen lips. My body locked in place, my mind scrambling to rationalize what I had just heard. It must have been me, an echo of my own breath in the silence, or maybe some trick of acoustics in the room. But I knew better. The air in the apartment felt thick, pressing in from all sides, charged with something I couldn't name. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to turn on the lights, to leave. But I didn't. Instead, I stood frozen, eyes straining against the dark, ears tuned for the slightest sound. Nothing. The blinds had stopped moving. The room had gone still, but the unease remained, settling into my skin like dampness in old fabric. After what felt like hours, I forced myself to step forward. My muscles felt stiff, reluctant to obey. I reached for the light switch, expecting what? Something grabbing my wrist? The soft press of fingers against my skin? But when I flicked the switch, the overhead light flickered, then buzzed to life, washing the room in a sickly yellow glow. Nothing was there. No intruder. No shadow lurking in the corner. The chair was where it had always been, the coffee table undisturbed. My heart was still hammering, but my mind rushed to fill in the gaps. Maybe I had imagined the breath, half asleep and caught in the liminal space between dreaming and waking. Maybe the blinds had moved because of the air pressure shifting when I walked into the room. I told myself these things as I checked the locks twice. As I turned on every light in the apartment, including the bathroom and kitchen. As I sat on the couch, gripping my phone like a lifeline, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next day, I almost convinced myself that nothing had happened. Almost. But something was different. The apartment felt off. The air wasn't stale anymore, it carried the faintest hint of something, a scent I couldn't quite place. Not mold, not dust. Something sharper. The kind of smell that lingers after someone's been in a room too long. I tried to push it from my mind, but as the day wore on, a new detail began gnawing at me. Something small, almost laughably insignificant compared to what had happened the night before. My keys weren't where I had left them. I always dropped them in the ceramic dish by the door. Always. It was a habit so ingrained that I did it without thinking. But when I was about to leave for work, they weren't there. I found them on the kitchen counter instead, right next to the sink. I told myself I must have put them there absent-mindedly. I was tired, on edge. Maybe I had carried them with me while making coffee, set them down without realizing it. But deep down, something about it sent a cold knot into my stomach. I tried to ignore it, but then the same thing happened again. And again. Not just with the keys. My wallet. A book I had been reading. The remote control. Every time, small objects moved, not far, never dramatically, just enough to unsettle me. Just enough to make me doubt myself. I started taking pictures of things before going to bed. Proof. Something solid to hold on to when I woke up the next morning and found my phone charger unplugged, my coat draped over the back of a chair instead of hanging by the door. And every morning the pictures confirmed what I already knew. I wasn't moving these things. But something was. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. I stopped sleeping properly. Nights turned into something I endured rather than rested through. I'd lay in bed, listening, waiting for something to happen. Every night, without fail, it did. Objects moved. Noises stirred. The apartment itself seemed to shift, breathing in ways that defied logic. A chair slightly angled away from the table. A book nudged half an inch off center. My bathroom door left open just a crack, though I always shut it before bed. And then there were the sounds. The soft creak of a floorboard in the hallway. The faint, deliberate tap, tap, tap from the living room. The almost imperceptible rustle of fabric, like someone adjusting their weight in an unseen seat. Worse than all of that was the breathing. I started hearing it more often, always just on the edge of awareness. In the dead of night, I'd wake up to that quiet inhale, as if something just beyond sight was sharing my space, watching me. One night I finally snapped. The tap, tap, tap started again, not loud, not urgent, but persistent. I threw back the blankets and stormed into the living room, fists clenched, my body rigid with fear masquerading as anger. I turned on the light, ready to find what? A stranger? A raccoon? A figment of my exhausted imagination? Nothing. Just my empty living room looking exactly as it should. Except it wasn't. Something was missing. It took me a moment to realize. A single mug. One of the two I owned. The one I always kept on the second shelf in the cabinet. It was gone. I checked the sink, the counter, the fridge, as if I had somehow lost my mind enough to put it there. Nothing. I should have gone back to bed. Should have let it go. But something gnawed at me, a cold certainty I couldn't shake. I checked the apartment methodically, room by room, my breath shallow, my skin prickling with something I refused to name. Then, in the last place I looked, because why the hell would it be there? I found it. The missing mug sat in the middle of the hallway. Perfectly centered. The sight of it, so mundane, so wrong, sent a deep, animal terror into my gut. It hadn't been there when I walked through. I was sure of it. I reached for it slowly, every nerve screaming at me to leave it alone. My fingers brushed the ceramic, and in that instant, every hair on my body stood on end. I wasn't alone. The air behind me shifted. Not a draft. Not imagination. Something moved. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I spun around, heart hammering. There was nothing there. Just my empty apartment, bathed in sickly yellow light, stretching out in front of me like an open mouth. I should have run. Should have grabbed my keys and left, never looking back. Instead, I did the worst possible thing. I whispered, "What do you want?" And the apartment answered. A slow, deliberate sound. A breath. Right behind me. The breath was impossibly close, warm, damp, tinged with something stale. My muscles locked, every instinct screaming at me to run, to lash out, to do anything except what I did. I turned around. There was nothing. But I knew something was there. The air felt denser, charged, like the room itself had lungs, had weight. I could feel it pressing in, a presence unseen but undeniable. My heartbeat pounded in my skull, my skin damp with a cold sweat. The mug still sat on the floor between my feet, absurdly ordinary in the dim light. I picked it up with shaking hands, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles ached. I half expected the ceramic to be warm, as if something had just held it before me. But it wasn't. It was cool, lifeless. The silence stretched. I strained my ears, waiting, dreading another breath, another shift, a whisper in the dark. Nothing. I backed away, every step careful, deliberate. The apartment was small, but the distance to my bedroom felt endless. I kept expecting to feel something, a hand brushing against my arm, fingers curling around my wrist, the slow drag of unseen nails against my skin. But I made it. The moment I reached my bedroom, I slammed the door shut. I didn't lock it. What would be the point? What I was afraid of wasn't locked outside. It had always been inside. I sat on the edge of my bed, the mug still clutched in my hands, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. My reflection in the dresser mirror across the room looked foreign, pale, hollow-eyed, trembling. Minutes passed. Then hours. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that the mug was gone again. I stared at the empty space where I had left it, my stomach a knot of cold dread. Slowly, as if in a dream, I turned my head toward the dresser. There it was. Not on the floor. Not on the nightstand. On the dresser, placed with careful precision. And next to it, something else. My phone. Unlocked. The screen glowing in the dark. A single photo open in the gallery. I reached for it slowly, the blood roaring in my ears. The image was grainy, dimly lit. It had been taken in this room from the foot of my bed. I stared at the picture, my mind trying to reject what my eyes saw. The bed was there. The crumpled blankets. My own sleeping form. And behind me, just inches from my face, a shape. Not quite a shadow, not quite a figure. Just the faintest outline of something that should not be there. Watching. Waiting. Breathing. I dropped the phone. The sound of it hitting the floor was deafening in the stillness. And then from the hallway. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. The tapping was slow, deliberate. The kind of sound made by someone who wasn't in a hurry, who knew they had time. I couldn't move. The weight of dread pressed down on me, rooting me to the bed, my breath shallow and sharp. My eyes stayed locked on the phone where it had landed, the image still glowing on the screen. I wasn't alone. I never had been. The realization settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I had let something in, or maybe it had always been here, watching, waiting for me to notice. And now that I had, it wasn't pretending anymore. The tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. A few feet beyond the bedroom door. Closer now. I swallowed hard, forcing my body to move. My limbs were stiff, trembling as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cold floor. The apartment was dead silent except for the faint ringing in my ears. The air felt wrong. Thick, almost humid, carrying a scent that was neither familiar nor entirely foreign, something like damp wood, old sweat, the stale breath of a room sealed too long. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking as I picked it up, careful not to glance at the screen again. My pulse hammered against my ribs. The lock screen had changed. The time was frozen, 3:12 a.m. And underneath it, just two words. Look now. A sharp breath caught in my throat. My hands tightened around the phone, a cold shudder rolling through my spine. I hadn't typed that. The tapping started again. But this time it wasn't just 3 beats. It was longer, slower. A series of taps in an unnatural rhythm, each one spaced just slightly too far apart, like a code I wasn't meant to understand. I had to leave. No. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me. My fingers fumbled for the lamp beside my bed. The moment I switched it on, the bulb flickered once, then died, plunging the room back into thick darkness. I sucked in a breath. And then, the closet door creaked open. Not fast. Not sudden. Slowly. A movement just barely perceptible in the dark, but there, undeniable. The whisper of wood against wood. The soft scrape of something shifting inside. I felt it before I saw it. The air in the room changed, became denser, occupied. The faintest shift of weight, of something unseen leaning forward from within the shadows. And then the breath came again. Right there. Close enough to touch. I didn't think. I ran. Out of the bedroom, through the hallway, past the kitchen. My feet barely made a sound against the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop, didn't dare look back. The apartment was suffocating, the walls too tight, the dark stretching behind me like an open mouth. I reached the front door, my fingers scrambling for the lock, but it wouldn't turn. My lungs seized. My hands slick with sweat, fumbling, shaking. Why won't it turn? Behind me from the bedroom. The sound of footsteps. Slow. Unhurried. The floorboards creaked under unseen weight. A shadow stretched along the hallway wall, moving closer. The lock finally gave way. The door flew open and I stumbled into the cold, dimly lit corridor outside. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I ran. Down the stairs, past the other apartments, out into the night. Only when I reached the street, my body shivering in the cool air, did I dare look up at my window. The blinds were drawn. But I swear I saw them move. The night air hit me like a slap, cold, biting, too sharp against my overheated skin. My breath came in ragged gulps, my pulse hammering against my skull. I stood in the middle of the street, staring up at my apartment window, willing myself to see nothing. But the blinds moved. Not from a draft. Not from the shifting of the building. They moved like something was standing just behind them, watching me. I took a step back. Then another. My legs felt weak, unsteady, as if the pavement beneath me wasn't real. The street was empty, the world around me silent except for the distant hum of traffic blocks away. The apartment building loomed above me, tall and indifferent. A place of concrete and wood and glass, something ordinary, something that should have been safe. But I had lived there. I knew better. I pulled my phone from my pocket, fingers trembling as I unlocked it. My call log was empty. The messages were gone. Every photo erased. Except one. My stomach turned to ice. My vision tunneled as I clicked on it, already knowing what I'd see. The same image as before my bed, my sleeping form. And behind me in the darkness, the shape. But it wasn't just a shape anymore. This time I could see the outline of a face. Not clear, not detailed, but there. A suggestion of eyes, deep and hollow. A mouth, slightly open, as if whispering something I couldn't hear. The worst part? It wasn't looking at me in the photo. It was looking at the camera. Looking at whoever had taken the picture. My stomach twisted. My grip on the phone faltered. A sound built in my throat, a whimper, a gasp, something raw and desperate. I didn't remember taking that photo. Because I hadn't. And yet, someone or something had. I turned away from the apartment, forcing my feet to move. My body felt detached, unsteady, like I was dragging myself through water. The city stretched ahead, indifferent, endless. I needed to go somewhere. Anywhere. A hotel. A friend's place. It didn't matter as long as it wasn't here. But as I started walking, a realization settled over me, slow and suffocating. It wasn't just the apartment. It wasn't just that space, those walls. It was me. I had carried it with me. And now it knew that I knew. The street stretched ahead, empty and indifferent, the buildings standing silent like they knew, like they had seen this before. My breath came shallow, uneven, but I kept walking, forcing one foot in front of the other. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to go. My fingers tightened around my phone. The screen was still lit, the photo still staring back at me. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but I hesitated. Would it matter? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I had left the apartment. I had put space between myself and that thing. And yet I could still feel it. The weight of it. The attention. It hadn't stayed behind. I swallowed, shoving my phone into my pocket, trying to drown out the thought with the sound of my footsteps. The city should have felt safer than my apartment, brighter, more open, but it didn't. The buildings loomed too high. The streetlights cast shadows too deep. Every doorway, every alley felt like something could be waiting just beyond sight. Watching. Following. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. But I knew better than to trust that. I needed people, noise, light, something to ground me. There was a diner a few blocks down, the kind that never closed, with 2 bright lights and a jukebox that always seemed to be playing something from decades ago. I set my sights on it, my pace quickening. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and grease, the hum of conversation a welcome relief. A couple sat in a corner booth, a tired-looking waitress refilled someone's cup. Normal. Real. I slid into a booth near the window, pressing my back against the vinyl seat. The warmth of the space should have comforted me. It didn't, because I could still feel it. That heaviness. That weight in the air just out of reach. The waitress came over, chewing gum, her notepad poised. "You all right, Han?" The question hit me harder than it should have. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah." Coffee. Please. She gave me a look one I'd seen before, the way people looked at someone just on the edge of losing it. But she didn't push. Coming right up. She walked away and I pulled my phone out again. The screen lit up. The photo was gone. The breath caught in my throat. I checked my gallery. Empty. Every file. Every video. Like my phone had been wiped clean. I should have felt relieved. But I didn't. Because it wasn't just that the photo was gone. There was something new in its place. A video. The thumbnail was dark. Just a sliver of light. My hands trembled as I pressed play. At first there was nothing. Just the grainy darkness of a room barely lit. Then movement. A shape. Tall. Thin. Emerging from the shadows like it had always been there. Not walking. Gliding. Coming closer. The screen shook, the perspective shifting. Who was holding the camera? A sound crackled through the speaker, soft, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. My blood turned to ice. Then, a face. Too close to the screen. Not right. Not human. A mouth that shouldn't be a mouth. Eyes or the idea of them. It whispered something. I didn't understand the words. Didn't need to. The video ended. And then, my phone screen went black. The reflection in the glass. There was something behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The air behind me was heavy, thick, pressing against my skin like breath, like a presence. Like something had been waiting for me to notice. A hand, cold, dry, too light to be real, brushed against the back of my neck. A whisper, impossibly close, right against my ear. You brought me with you. The lights in the diner flickered. The jukebox cut out. The couple in the corner stopped talking. For one awful, endless moment. Everything was silent. And then, the lights went out. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story.